Arc 6, The Corridor of Memories. Chapter 16, Chewed Remains. The sound of something breaking, only the consciousness continued to hear endlessly. Bones were being chewed, gray matter being crushed, eyeballs cracking as liquid overflowed from them. Cranium, the head's bones were being crushed. Blocking what was inside, that important part was thoroughly defeated by the pressure of sharp fangs, and it was clear that it was all turning into a pulpy mess. Gray matter and spinal fluid flowed out together, mixing with an unknown yellow liquid pooling on the forehead, where blood vessels tore like thin mesh and red blood gushed forth. With all of that coming together, consciousness and memory transformed into flesh-colored vomit. Pain, there is pain. Stifling too. It felt like a cracking headache, and thinking so, the consciousness bitterly smiled. The pain from being shattered is not what it's about. There was nothing left to break, and everything important was already smashed. Besides, even when the part that feels pain has collapsed, what is left to say? The brain that accumulates memory flowed out, the organs used for thinking collapsed, the parts necessary for maintaining life in the first place were severed from the root. Do you know what happens when that happens? Once that is the case, humans will meet death. So, naturally, him too. Ram, Rusu. Barusu. Get yourself together. Beaten up and grabbed by the scruff of the neck, the intensely muddled consciousness was forcefully brought into light. The first thing he felt when returning was someone's voice close to his ears scolding him with a stern face. Not only was the sound of a trembling voice, but also a slight feeling on his face as if it had been slapped. Ram, Barusu, if you don't get up, I will burn off your eyelids. Subaru, Hook. As the sleeping mind heard those dreadful statements, his consciousness rapidly rose to the surface. As the voice called and dragged it out of that dark world, consciousness passed through a suffocating environment that appeared like the surface of water. And so, opening his eyelids before they get burned. Ram, Barusu, did you get up? Subaru, Immediately he encountered Ram's face in front, who narrowed her light crimson eyes. His breathing came back, her face was so close that he could touch her lips if he raised his mouth a bit. Of course, it does not mean that such colorful circumstances could exist. The reason Ram was leaning down so close was because the surroundings were so dark that they couldn't see each other's faces unless they looked very closely, that was there was to it. When he became aware of Ram in front of him, his sense of touch started to come back from the bottom up. Fine particles of sand rolled out from atop his body. Subaru had been lying spread-eagled on the sand sea. With a breath, air leaked out of Subaru's mouth, and Ram seemed to stare deep into his eyes for a short moment, and then slowly with the other hand she shined a lantern on his body. From the girl's hand, an orange light tore through the darkness, and Subaru understood that he was still trapped in the labyrinth of sand. No, he understood he had returned by death. Subaru, I am. Looking around the darkness, Subaru gradually remembered what happened. The shock at the moment of death was always vivid, and there was no sign that shaking off the memories was at all something he had gotten used to. Immersed in the trembling memory field, he struggled to remember the meaning of his certain death, and Subaru's last moments grazed past his fingertips as he remembered it. Subaru, His mind recollected the awful situation, as the lantern illuminated Ram's expression of hatred. And then, although they had a history of insults and abuse to begin with, there was no meaning behind the murder that led to that miserable end. Subaru, Ubu? Ram, Barusu? Making a confused face in front of Ram, Subaru involuntarily puts his hand over his mouth. Remembering the reality of Ram's death just a couple of minutes ago, and the desire to scream was not it. Actually, facing Ram and reliving his gruesome last moments, he wanted to vomit. Subaru, Ugh, gh. For Subaru, his deaths had already exceeded the number that could be counted by the fingers on both hands. And in this world with return by death, it could be said that the experience of losing a close friend like Amelia or Beatrice was the same as his own death. However, for Subaru, he never got used to death. For his own, or the death of someone else is equally the same. The fear of being dead himself or thinking that someone in his family might die tore at his heart. Indeed, in the last loop, the tragedy of Ram's brutal death was a shock he experienced for the first time. He had seen her figure being torn by the belly, breaking her neck, having her whole body mercilessly slashed, and then dying. Each death was full of anguish and grief, and Subaru can't compare people's deaths lining them up side by side. It doesn't feel right. However, it was the first time his head was crushed, chewed down and smashed. He also saw Ram's beautiful face being crushed by fangs without mercy. That was also a tragedy done in the hands of Patrash, who was also one of the most trusted beings for Subaru. Subaru. Being desperate was not the same as remembering. The more he tried to forget Ram's miserable end, the clearer the pink hair, and the remnants of the head that remained in the mouth of the Earth Dragon, gets engraved in Subaru's head. As a result, it was not possible to get over the urge to vomit, so Subaru turned toward the sand. However, his throat and stomach have not recovered from the impact of return by death, they just clamped and wouldn't obey Subaru's will. Subaru, hey, oh. Ram. Is this just because you woke up suddenly? Miserable. Tackling the ground, desperately trying to vomit the contents of his stomach, nothing came out. He was surprised because his throat was dry and not even a drop of saliva came out. He couldn't see Ram's expression looking at him with a lantern, but the surprised tone in her voice was easily conveyed. Naturally, the coldness reminded him of events just before that death. The passion that led to the murderous intent was rising for no reason, and the abuse that spewed out in the beginning and joined the violent passion, the impulse that drove to the urge inside the chest, it became dreadful. However, Ram, don't bite. Subaru, hook. In a word, the preamble. Ram sat down beside Subaru and lifted up his chin. The kneeling Subaru was surprised for a moment. Ram opened Subaru's mouth, with the same uninterested look as always, then thrusted her white fingers onto the back of Subaru's throat. Subaru. Ram, I knew that Barusa's unskillfulness was hardcore, but this is just like a baby. Having someone else's fingers entering his throat, Subaru felt like his esophagus was being rudely violated. But then, the stomach and throat, which had resisted vomiting until then, gave a new surprise. This time it desperately began to push out the gastric juice and saliva altogether. With tearful eyes, Subaru gets rid of his urge to vomit on the sand by letting out the stomach's content. He only spit out gastric juice and drool, but it was still much better than it was before vomiting. Subaru, bastard. Ha, bad. Well, okay, oh. Ram, so? I'm glad that you seem satisfied. Subaru, you. Subaru wiping his mouth with a sleeve, Ram shrugs her shoulders and returns to her usual childish attitude. Despite her attitude, it was true that she was guilty of treating him like a baby. There was no room to argue that, and Ram's palm was still gently stroking Subaru's back. It was hard to understand her bitter affection. Subaru, the hand, it's all right. More than that, this place. Ram, you remember that the barrier got broken and the sandy sea cracked in front of us? That swallowed our dragon carriage there, and as a result we got thrown in here. Ram threw out her conjectures while Subaru looked at the surroundings. Subaru was hesitant to decide whether to embrace the relief or anxiety for the continuation of the return by death in response to her remark. However, in either case, action must be taken quickly. According to that judgment, trying to keep up with the words when you awoke in the underground, did Barusa worry about REM? What about Emilia? What about Beatrice-sama? Did you worry about someone you did not find? Subaru. What revitalized his mind was those sharp and depressed words of Ram's. The discord that invited the last events, the situation where friends killed each other, was obviously abnormal. He must come back to his senses, but he can hardly return to himself recalling the situation. In the first place, the trick was abnormal. The accumulation of negative emotions was amplified to the extent that it became so absurd to the point of killing each other in a bloody fight. Ram, Barusu? Ram tilts her head at Subaru's state as his words don't come out. The last time they talked, that abnormal situation followed suit. But of course, there was no meaning in being concerned about the words Ram said in such a state. But it was inaccurate to say that everything said was a lie. The fact is that Subaru felt that Ram's dissatisfaction or indignation was not fake but true, even though it was amplified to the extent that it was abnormal. Not everything was untrue. Then, it was true that Subaru's attitude seemed like he didn't worry about Emilia and the others, and Ram had held some grudge at his wording. If consideration was given to that feeling, Subaru should be worried about Emilia here in any shape. Actually, he was worried, so it wasn't a lie to act that way. However, he just knew that he couldn't do anything about what he was worried about. Subaru. In the meantime, Subaru realized deception should be packed in words. He knew it was necessary to avoid a discussion, but still hesitated to deceive Ram by lying. Calculatively worrying about his peers and deceiving others disgusting. Naturally, that's hard to swallow. Because that's how you get someone's displeasure, because it means nothing to some extent. Subaru, that. Everyone. Ram, it is useless to blame yourself so much, there is no point in pursuing what you are not responsible for. There should be something to give priority over wasting time like that. However, before Subaru could speak his words of worry, Ram reached her own conclusion on Subaru's feelings. That being said, she had misread the expression of Subaru, who had a serious face. It was rare to see through Ram's heart with her erroneous words and actions, which was evidence that she was impatient. Ram, besides, we've already wasted time with Barusa's vomiting. Of course, Ram never displays such threatening behavior of her own heart. Subaru was lost in judgment as to what to make of Ram's attitude, who could be very stubborn. After that, Ram moved first without saying anything. While she wiped the finger which was thrusted into Subaru's mouth, she turned the lantern toward the back of the labyrinth. Ram, we can't stay here, I need to be with REM and we have to join up with Emilia-sama. Subaru, I know, here, where is this place? Ram, besides Ram and Barusu, it seems like you came back. Ram turns back, and following her words and gaze, coming from the other side of the labyrinth were Anastasia and Patrash with a shaking light, fluctuating and swaying. Subaru's eyes shook slightly, as he saw the jet-black dragon mixed in the dark. The glamorous and ferocious beautiful face that was illuminated by the flickering orange light. A row of fangs like blades that could be seen in the closed mouth, crushed the girl's head, and even Subaru himself all of a sudden. Those things can't happen normally. Subaru, idiot, I'm stupid. Clenching his teeth, Subaru tried to push back his fear. In that abnormal situation, the directed murderous intention couldn't be real. For Subaru, the experience of being killed by Patrash was carved into his heart as a scar that could not be healed. Still, Subaru should have repeatedly confronted the existence that killed him. Subaru, yeah, even REM and Ram at first. But now Ram and REM have become very close. Subaru remembered the dedicated support they gave him and forgave them. At first the relationship was at its worst, there were times when his life was targeted and he was deprived. Compared to that, it's a good thing that those previous events were not true. Subaru, yes, that's right, that should be. He embraced his shoulders and grabbed his skin as if he was feeling the cold. In the basement of the Sand Sea, this place dominated by sand and darkness, it was certainly cold. However, the reason for feeling cold was different from that of outside. Anastasia, Natsuki-kun, you seem to have woken up. Ram, thanks. So, how is the surrounding? In the front, Ram and Anastasia were talking. He should be able to find a balance between the strategy of this labyrinth of sand based on the information he got today. Originally, Subaru had blended in there, and there were many things he had to say. But even now, the priority was to calm his mind and to stop the shaking of his knees. With returning by death, he should have left behind the events and impacts immediately before death. But even if you try to quench it, fear emerges and the passion of that moment revives. Subaru kept endlessly resisting to disperse those feelings. Subaru. In such a state, Subaru was looking at the lonely jet-black earth dragon. The heart of Subaru, which should have returned by death, has not returned to its original state. Apart from such circumstances, the contents of the exploration of the 4 underground labyrinths time loops were almost identical. In search of others, the group headed by Subaru slowly moved in the cold darkness. With the lantern lighting up a small area, the journey is slow and frustrating, while the rest of the roadside was drenched in shadows. Truth be told, Subaru wants to omit the road selection. For Subaru, this had been the way he'd gone twice already. There was no way Emilia and the rest were strolling in the area that he could see. If it was said that it did not mean to appeal to 2 people at the back, omitting himself and not speaking up was impossible. As a result, it was not even settled at all, and even as the frustrating march upped its pace, Subaru's impatience only rose as time went by. Anastasia, everyone else is probably okay, in our case, we're just barely in luck to have Patrash-chan here. Subaru and Ram. Anastasia, if you think about a situation without any ride, it's hell for men in this Sand Sea. Anxiety is normal due to insufficient battle strength. Subaru and Ram. Anastasia, at worst, I will not hesitate to make use of my trump card, but I'm afraid it will eat up Anastasia's lifetime. So let me rely on the 2 of you? Subaru and Ram. Anastasia. Hey. Would both Natsuki-sama and Ram-san care to talk? Well, for a little while I am the only one talking. As their exploration expanded, Anastasia chatted continuously as she indicated her crossness. Subaru stopped and looked back at her complaints about the silent environment. Anastasia then brightened up her face, taking a deep breath. Subaru, well, we've run out of things to talk about, for now we are sort of desperate to find the other guys. I don't have time to chatter uselessly. Anastasia, there's no twaddle or anything. I'm talking to you about the future plan. And it is usually Natsuki-kun's role that the chat continues. Only now it is quiet, the 2 girls. No, us 4's anxieties are going up. Subaru, 4, ha. As Subaru pouts his lips, Anastasia doesn't lose her will to fight. The 2 girls referred to Ram and Anastasia, but if you rephrase them as 4 people it would be the result of adding Echidna and Patrash. Strictly because of the Anastasia equals Echidna state, it is a scene to paraphrase with 3 people, but it is not a problem to correct in the first place. Subaru. Subaru thinks, narrowing his black eyes at Anastasia, who is puffing her cheeks. The real Anastasia is dormant, and only now she appeared as Scarf Dona. Even so, her behavior had become so familiar, it seemed as if she had blended in. It is unfortunate that neither Subaru nor Ram held the initiative to see her true intentions from her expression or behavior. In the discord that culminated last time in killing each other, Though the thing about Ram and Patrash was conscious because of the enormity of the endings, Anastasi's attitude was also discomforting. Ram's enmity and Patrash's attack, the two who apparently had gone crazy, were easy to understand. However, it was hard to judge whether Anastasia had fallen into insanity at first sight, and he didn't know what was in her mind until the last moment. Of course, due to the difference in strength, Anastasia was killed by Ram, but the cunningness was not a thing to worry about, such as concealing a knife in an emergency bag or making a pretense to seize it. Normally, you have to be unconscious to be caught off guard and killed in a strange way. Subaru, do whatever. To think, have they always been hostile to him? Subaru. Facing ahead, Subaru hit himself hiding from Ram and Anastasia. His mouth was cut with just one punch without a miss, and he felt a sharp pain as his tongue tasted blood. Then he would hurt himself to dispel the cloudiness of his consciousness. Ram and Anastasia, they are not acting abnormally. It was Subaru who was not able to let go of the abnormality now. Subaru, great, it's funny that I can't understand myself, just shivering. Has he gone crazy, or is everyone else insane? Subaru had become a little haughty, so everything except him was wrong. Ultimately, of course, it was all a mistake. Straying himself, Subaru arrogantly decided that he was right, acting like a fool denying the surroundings. Finally, he was told that he was wrong. It was pointed out from the beginning that he could acknowledge it. It's an accurate, vivid memory. However, the current Subaru acknowledges its abnormality in normalcy. It's terrible not being able to tame the abnormality, so much that it's dreadfully horrible. At this point, Subaru remembers this desolate sensation in his heart, where the loneliness drives into craving madness. This was the horizon that the madman, Betelgeuse Romane Conti, had reached. Being aware of his own madness, recognizing his abnormality simply, this was the view that madman saw. Ram, Barusu, what's wrong? While he was feeling disgusting empathy, Ram's voice fell on trembling Subaru's back. Subaru swallowed the blood mixed with saliva and looked back at those two, acting like nothing happened. Subaru, nothing, just sand in my shoes makes me feel uncomfortable. Ram, Barusa being silent in particular, Ram's heart doesn't care even a bit, but behind Anastasia Sama's words, there is also a reason. Subaru, what? Ram, even if it's you who are silent, holding back something won't ease a woman's anxiety. If you want to do that, then hide it better. Subaru. Subaru once again bends his lips to those words. The meaning of Ram's words was obvious, it couldn't be mistaken. Then he also noticed that Ram's words were translations of Anastasia's hard-to-understand words. It seemed as if he was being seen through, and his heart rather began to scatter. Subaru, it's vague, I don't think I can explain by saying it. Ram, it is too bad that the meaning of Barusu's words are not understandable now. If you're worried about something, you should pay more attention to it. Anastasia, Ramsan is really an unforgiving opponent for Natsuki-kun. Tutang at Subaru's words, Ram's usual sharp tongue strikes back. With bitterness and sharpness close to being poisonous, Anastasia gives a bitter smile. To Anastasia's calm composure, Ram shrugged her shoulders. Ram, please be relieved, Barusu is pretty happy, 'cause he's a pervert who enjoys suffering. Subaru, what the hell are you talking about? Why on earth are you judging on what I am? Don't turn me into a punching bag so freely, okay? You know? The only one you can hit is a guy who's ready to hit you? Ram, humph. Snorting her nose, Ram's attitude of making a fool out of a fool is almost her usual self. Unlike Subaru's mood, her already being able to return to her self-indulgent self was envious. Enviously being envious or just hateful, he feels disgusted just thinking about her. However, even though they are having the usual chit-chats, the color of disturbing shadows would soon be diluted. Subaru, explaining something that is difficult to explain. I am just a little paranoid now. When he said it again, it sounded more futile than he had imagined. It's also worth mentioning that Ram and Anastasia may act surprised in response to that. Looking at it, Patrash seemed to be somewhat amazed. For Patrash, who is clever and able to discern the reason behind things, it is possible that she sees Subaru as weak-minded now. Rather, if she quits being with Subaru and starts serving a proper lord, it would be way better for her. Actually, he felt like even Ram and Anastasia were better at handling Patrash. If she thinks that he was an obstacle for that, it is natural to peel her tusks into Subaru. Subaru, stop it. Anastasia, I understand it was more serious than how stupid it sounded when put it into words. Anastasia evaluates Subaru, who was staring at Patrash, and was gradually getting swayed. When it was realized that the reason was ridiculous, relief and anxiety simultaneously increased. It was like the girls had excluded Subaru from their choices. Before that happens, still. Subaru, I am a really bad person. Anastasia, perhaps it would be easier if we seriously tied him up and carried him, no? Turning his face red or making it pale, Anastasia threw a spoon at Subaru, who was making faces. Ram curls her eyebrow, thinking however about Anastasia's observation. Ram, even if we do tie up Barusa's hands and legs, it won't be a fundamental solution. Subaru, do not use such words that you might make an enemy out of me. Ram, it's not that of a big deal, but I don't want to turn Ram into an enemy of Emilia-sama and Beatrice-sama. I won't be able to face REM again. Thinking about Ram, Subaru struggles not to harbor any hostility against her. While fighting with such emotions, there was in fact a good thing. In reality, that isn't something to think about in this situation. However, making a journey to explore the Pleiades watchtower, in the labyrinth of sand, twice going through return by death till now, a question which has to be asked. When it comes to REM, Ram reacts awfully sensitively. Subaru. Of course, for Subaru it's a good sign that Ram cares about REM. For REM, who is erased from everyone's memory other than Subaru, only Subaru has a bond with her. Although, it certainly brings a special feeling in Subaru, but it does not bring any meaning in a practical sense. As for the isolated circumstances of REM, Ram is trying to get closer to her family as much as possible. Of course, no memory of REM is left in her, that's the sad fact he came to know over the past year. On the other hand, however, there is no doubt that Ram accepts the existence of another girl like herself, REM, more heavily than the truth informed by Subaru. And apparently those feelings were so much, so that was beyond Subaru's imagination, perhaps the actual feelings were being brought back to Ram. That can be seen from the explosion of discontent in the previous labyrinth loop which triggered the outburst for Subaru's lack of consideration. She could not remember. Yet Ram's feelings were comparable to what he could remember. The feeling was deeper than what Subaru thought. But in reality, is it only that? Ram. It's unpleasant. Subaru, no, it's disgusting. Not even that. It's damn paranoia. Ram, have you gotten yourself up on a pedestal? There's no use. Subaru, if I am on a pedestal, aren't you taking yourself on a god-level pedestal and looking down on others? Thus, it is safe to say that the relationships have not changed from usual. Even though the mood changes instantaneously, and the warm feelings turn into cold-hearted hostility. Only at that time, you could hate someone. Anastasia, if you look carefully, Natsuki-kun's behavior, what should be the cause? Ram, did you also notice that Anastasia-sama? Anastasia, well, it seems that Natsuki-kun is obviously affected to some extent. I think. Because of the circumstances, Subaru was being invaded by the paranoia of suspecting anything and everything. Ram and Anastasia looked at each other as if they were getting some hint. Rather, only Subaru knew the real reason. With both of their perceptions, they were becoming even more cautious. Alas, while speaking so, it was clear that Subaru's every move was being carefully observed to an extent that it was getting annoying. Subaru, annoying, huh, how foolish. Anastasia, did you say something? Subaru, just my stupidity. Therefore, what do you think? While puzzling the minds in their own sensitivity, Ram and Anastasia were also getting puzzled. Then, in response to Subaru's question, they turned ahead together. Being lured by the development looking forward, they could definitely understand what he said. The crossroads have appeared in front of the eyes. Anastasia, I felt the disgusting wind flowing from a while ago, but now I realize the source. Ram, this bad wind invokes discord. As Meili described it, Barusa's body odor seems to summon demon beasts. And by nature, the affinity is bad. No, I wonder if it's better. Subaru, do you understand what this disgusting feeling is? Ram, Barusa's present condition, and if Barusa's body odor multiplies the factor by many times, the answer would be the same. Subaru, don't say body odor so many times. In the past two loops, they unanimously agreed on the subject of bad feeling. Then, Subaru's current physical condition and present circumstances were intertwined. Thus a different opinion was born. Ram and Anastasia looked at each other and nodded together. Ram and Anastasia, miasma. Subaru, the witches, huh? Then, going ahead would mean. Anastasia, though I'm not sure, it is a well-known fact that there is a witch's shrine beyond the sand dunes. Oh, and since the sand sea distortion is solvable, even if it was connected by some accident. Ram, it turned out to be an unexpected shortcut or something like that. Therefore, the miasma caused their souls to become corrupted and stirred up a discord that ended up in killing each other. On top of that, the possibility of that statement's existence, Anastasia smiles bitterly and points at the way. The crossroad splitting into two, miasma drifting from the right, and the centaur's nest on the left. Of course, about the threats lurking in the left road, he intended to cleverly speak after this, but for the time being, which way should they go? Anastasia, so, which way do you think is the right answer? At Anastasia's question, Subaru and Ram looked away from each other. But their voices had joined together unintentionally when said. Subaru and Ram left. That was the case. Chapter 17, The King of the Sand Sea. The non-combatant team unanimously opted to take the left path in the fork. It was evident that if they progressed down the right path, they'd end up being swallowed up by the miasma, resulting in discord arising that would develop into them killing each other. That's why there was no mistake in that choosing the left path was the most natural thing. That, and for Subaru, the questions were providing him answers too. Though, since the left path wasn't exactly a safe bet either, the one who was setting him those questions was of ill nature. If he labeled the right path as an emotional snare, then he'd have to label what awaited them on the left path as a physical snare. That grotesque witch beast clad in flames he would prefer to avoid meeting the centaur, if possible. Even if he engaged in battle with it, his odds of success were slim, that much was obvious. Their difference in strength wasn't the only issue. The reason being that when the time came to encounter the witch beast in his current emotional state, he didn't hold any belief in himself about whether he could fight alongside Ram and Anastasia. Subaru, to tell you the truth, there was a time back at the sand dunes where I saw a damn weird witch beast in the distance. It had a human body sprouting up from the neck of a body that looked like Patrash's, and it had a huge mouth gaping from abdomen to chest there. And finally, a huge horn sprouted up from its human body where the head should be. Anastasia, what the hell? That's so gross. Ram, honestly, that's so off-putting. They followed the same flow of witch-beast-related talk as last time, in which he naturally included his explanation about the centaur's particularities. The reactions from the two female members of the group in response to his description 3, including Patrash, were once again unpleasant. It's not as if Subaru wanted to give this explanation because he wanted to. Nevertheless, he had to consider that there was a 70% chance that they wouldn't be able to avoid an encounter with that thing now that they were going down the left path. Subaru, I'd expected all of you to be charmed by it, but in any case, it definitely seems like a dangerous creature. For the time being, I'll go ahead and call it a centaur, but it ain't just that its appearance looks disgusting, the mane on the back of its body burns up into flame. It seemed crazy strong. To say the least, it doesn't seem like we'd be able to beat it. Ram, why did you ignore a witch beast like that after spotting it? Do you have a death wish? Subaru, He had explained it whilst keeping his emotions from billowing out as much as he could, however anger had welled up in him the moment Ram had replied in her usual frivolous manner. Despite him having expressly warned her, who did she think she was? She always arrogantly looked down on others, thinking that, he felt his anger morphing into hatred. Subaru took a deep breath. He did everything he could to keep his violent emotions in check, to settle himself down. Subaru, damn this. This place is the worst. Ram, it sure is demanding, isn't it? Even I have to pay attention to the words I choose. Subaru, if you're going to choose them now, then perhaps, they ain't gonna make anything better. Both Ram's voice and expression were tinged with sympathy for Subaru, who was overwhelmed by his emotions. However, as her sympathetic attitude kept irritating him, he had to say that what she'd done too had ended up producing the opposite effect. Anastasia, it's easy to talk about the effects of the miasma, but that's all that's scary about it, don't you think? In reality, me and Ram-san ain't affected. Subaru, what do you mean by that? If you're thinking flowery thoughts like only we will be okay, then you'd better stop. If we scratch off the surface, me and you are the same. Anastasia, what harsh words. I didn't mean that even I've got that much self-confidence. One's capacity for judgment and determination, and so on, are different issues to the strength of one's mind and body. However, going about it like you're completely paralyzed by the scariness of the miasma is pretty bad, don't you think? Anastasia offered her candid advice to him, phrased with an air of superiority. Though her words were rational, Subaru grew irritated that she hadn't gotten the point. Standing at the head of the group, Subaru had pressed his prior point to her as he marched on through the passageway of sand. On hearing that, Anastasia cleared her throat with a small hem and said, Anastasia, what I have to say is related to the miasma, though since it's not like even I know too well about it, can you forgive me if what I say is gonna be rough? Subaru, I imagine the only ones who really know all the details about it are the witch cult, right? Anastasia, indeed, but in the world, there's also the kind of people who like to poke into things which people despise. For example, there's the weirdos who go around studying stuff like miasma, Though, what I know about it is something which barely resembles the truth from a rumor of a rumor of a rumor. Was what Anastasia had brought up surmised to be a witch researcher? It had a strange ring to it, but it would be pretty silly to presume they didn't exist, if he thought about it. This world likely had people like researchers too. And of course, all such individuals who possessed this thirst for knowledge would rationally avoid searching for taboos and keep in line with the flow of the world. No, there was no way they'd have such an upright, pious nature. There would be incarnations of curiosity who wouldn't fit in with the mold, whatever world or era it may be. Anastasia, though before I dive straight into what I know from that rumor, we have to ask first of all, what is miasma? Ram, it's the contaminated manna which the witch and witch beasts let off, right? I've also heard that witch cultists let off the same thing like that. Anastasia, Ramsan's answer is the prevalent view. The miasma's something which the witch gives off, so even the witch beasts, which were created by the witch, emit it in a similar fashion. However, have you heard of this? Ram. Anastasia, have you heard that witch cultists and witch beasts in fact really detest each other? Anastasia equals Eridna spoke without pause. Knowing what the creator was like, they were fond of flaunting off their own knowledge, perhaps. It looked like Anastasia's gilded plate had been torn off, and underneath it, the white fox's true nature had showed through. Ram's eyes widened at Anastasia's words, in stark contrast to Subaru, who had harbored that impression. Both witch beasts and witch cultists were creatures that she thought were leal to the witch of envy. Perhaps she was surprised to learn that in the truth they didn't get along. Ram, I can barely bring myself to believe that. But is this for real? Anastasia, unfortunately, I don't know for sure since I ain't acquainted with either any witch cultists or witch beasts. That's why I introduced it as something from a rumor. But don't you think it'd be interesting if this was a true story? Subaru, interesting. Subaru responded, having gotten the impression that she shouldn't have described it that way to begin with. Anastasia replied to him with a curt nod, saying aha. Anastasia, everyone in the world thinks that the witch and the witch cultists and the witch beasts are good friends, right? And yet, it ain't known that in fact, the two of them under the witch are hostile with each other. This misunderstanding has gone on overlooked for 400 years. No one knows the actual truth. Ram, surely that's... Anastasia, I apologize for bringing this rumor forward too, but it seems like there's many misconceptions about the miasma too. For example, the relation between the witch beasts and the miasma is the exact opposite than what is known, in that the witch beasts loathe it. And it's said that they hate the witch in their true feelings as well. Ram, no way could it be like that. Ram kept piling Anastasia with her doubts, drawn in by her story. Behind the two of them immersed in this exchange, Subaru grasped that Anastasia equals Eridna's words were substantiated by a rather undeniable factor. The relations between witches and witch beasts were in fact poor, and witch beasts do hate the witch. That possibility made complete sense to him, considering how much he'd made use of the witch's lingering scent until now. If it wasn't like that, then why would it have made the witch beasts seethe so much, making them frantically pursue him, who was covered in the witch's scent? He had used his lingering scent against the first witch beast invasion after he had been summoned to this parallel world. And he'd even used it against the white whale. It was impossible to disregard the relatedness between the witch's lingering scent and the miasma if he gathered all the evidence he'd seen up until now. The witch's lingering scent that surrounded him seemed to be miasma itself. Subaru, there's no way that all of these witch beasts would have Patelagis-like Yandere attributes. He wouldn't be able to allow the witch's scent from these creatures, other than from the witch. It'd be like having another woman's scent. It was disgusting to think about, if that was the case, but the aforementioned possibility was suitable in regards to a logical explanation. In other words, the witch beasts hated the witch's miasma and strongly looked on at it in hostility. And to start with, most people shouldn't know that the theory which stated that the witch of envy created the witch beasts was actually incorrect. The one who created the witch beasts wasn't the witch of envy but rather the witch of gluttony. Since that hadn't been circulated around, it seemed like nobody noticed the relations between the witch beasts and the miasma as well. Anastasia's source of knowledge rather, he didn't know whether there really was a researcher who studied the witch, but if they did exist, they sure did make a good point. Subaru, what a complete farce, huh? Subaru sighed at his own lack of concern, having thought about it to this extent. It was more natural to think that she just spewed out the knowledge that Anastasia equals Eridna had known from the start, rather than doubting whether said researcher existed or not. When Subaru's train of thought moved to that, a different form of anger gradually started to take root in him. Why did Subaru have to hide the circumstances around Anastasia being Eridna like this? There was his consideration towards Julius and the Iron Fang. In particular, Julius in his current state had completely slipped out from the memories of the world. Julius tried to act his same old self as much as he could, but even in him, there was a part that was careless about it. Taking that into consideration, Subaru had decided that he should avoid any extra mental burdens. He should avoid them, but why was it that he had to bear the burden instead? Subaru. Everybody was selfish. Why was it just him who had to do everything to cover those guys' asses? It was irritating. It was annoying. He might as well just spill the beans about everything, shouldn't he? He might as well tell them about Anastasia's spirit, his return by death, everything. Ram, Barusu. Stop sticking your head in the sand all of a sudden, it's strange. Subaru, it's just my natural defensive reaction to stop our relations from getting any worse. Fea. Since Subaru's anger was reaching its boiling point, he had stuck his face into the wall of sand before he hurled abuse at them. The wall of sand was unexpectedly brittle, and it appeared like he'd be able to dig through it with his hands. In return for finding that out, Subaru spat out sand from his mouth. There was something to think about in Ram's cold expression, but since he was responsible for his own actions, he kept any retaliation to himself. Anastasia, could Natsuki-kun's eccentric behavior also be from the miasma's influence? Perhaps? Ram, nope, Barusu's behavior is as usual. Subaru, it ain't as usual. It's just an aftershock from the miasma's influence. Anastasia, well, regarding the authenticity of things there, if we get back to what we were talking about whilst you were crying out. The witch beasts in truth hate the witch. If we presume that, then there's gotta be an explanation for the witch cultists and the witch beasts being hostile with each other, no? Anastasia, who deliberately found a lull in their conversation to shift the topic back to the main point, ponderously inclined her head. However, Subaru's like-minded opinion didn't reach her words. Instead, Ram nodded and said, Ram, whether they're hostile with each other or not, I've never heard of the two of them acting together. To begin with, there's also that rumors of the witch cult don't spread. Subaru, I see, then it's really the type of secret organization where those guys keep it hidden and move about in secret. I wonder why they don't leave any impressions at all though. Ram, Barusu and Emilia-sama come across those guys far too often. All the witch cultists which Subaru knew strongly craved the limelight, and were absorbed in an inflated sense of their own self-worth. He couldn't even say that Betelgeuse's movements had been kept surreptitious, and what's more, the other Sin archbishops had went all the way up to making a broadcast after having hijacked one of the great cities. How could those guys claim that they were an evil organization that operated in the shadows? Subaru, but wait up. What about the white whale? That thing was cooperating with the witch cult, though now it's a bit suspicious whether it was or not, there was still that time. Anastasia, Even though I know that the witch beasts definitely do hate the witch cult, I'm not too sure whether the witch cult hate the witch beasts, though, either way, even if it's not like that, I ain't gonna fuss over it. Subaru, that's what I told you. Providing a suitable rebuttal to Subaru's objection, Anastasia threw down her personal opinion straight away. That she didn't cling to it was perhaps indeed proof that she'd heard it from the rumors of another's opinion. However, she'd thoroughly used it as the basis of her conversation. In the end, Anastasia closed one of her eyes and said, Anastasia, in the end, we can just put it as that we don't understand the connection between the miasma well. There's also the way Ramsan looks at it, in which it's like contaminated mana, but, well, doesn't it seem like there's no one around who can explain what goes on for the mana to get contaminated like that? Ram. Anastasia, mana is mana, regardless of whose body it goes through. Even if its nature changes in magic, or when you craft with it, it ain't possible for anyone to add a little extra to the mana itself. Subaru, that's... Anastasia, why is it that the mana can just get contaminated with the Witch of Envy? And also, why the heck do witch cultists acclimatize to that contaminated mana? Quite unusually, Ram kept her mouth shut as Anastasia launched this barrage of questions. It was rather strange that she didn't raise any words of objection and kept silent. At the same time, Subaru was experiencing a sense of déjà vu along with his feeling of revulsion. The way she had presented it made both her point and conclusion vague. Everything about her attitude felt like she was speaking in riddles. That she seemed to overlap with Echidna left him quite the sour taste. Anastasia, all right, it seems like we've spent too much time idly gossiping, don't you think? Anastasia suddenly spoke out without any consideration for Ram's silence or Subaru's cathexis. The tone she'd been speaking in up until now suddenly changed, leaving them behind with the abrupt change of subject. Leaving the two of them in her wake, Anastasia shone her lantern at the front part of the passageway. Subaru also stopped in his tracks, imitating her. And as he held his lantern up, he noticed what was up. Subaru. In front of them, the passageway gradually turned to the left, and a faint breeze blew towards them. The wall of sand still hadn't changed in any respect, but he vividly remembered that smell of burning that mingled with the breeze, along with that sudden bend in the path. Ram, it smells like something burnt, like grilled meat, doesn't it? Ram let out her candid impressions about the breeze, which carried a tinge of hot air to it. The smell of overcooked, charred flesh streamed in from the depths of the passageway. Maybe it was possible that this aroma was proof that there was someone cooking, and that they'd be able to meet a friend party up ahead. However well-intentioned his thoughts were, they were tantamount to ignorance. Ram, Emilia-sama and the others carelessly set up a fire and are taking a break. I think something along those lines? Subaru, I do agree that Emilia would be the one that had seemingly set up a fire without any care, but with me mentioning the centaur, I can't at all imagine it being that. You two have to believe that this isn't your head filling up with overly optimistic thoughts, right? Ram, I'm looking forward to how you're going to come up with excuses for all these reckless remarks after the influence of the miasma is gone. Every time he replied in a snappier manner than was necessary to Ram's questions, he'd get toxicity scathingly thrown back from her too. Letting out a snort to that, Subaru reassured himself that the one he needed to turn his hostility to was not her. There was no doubt about that, considering they'd already made it here. There would be a large cave up ahead, and right there, the blasphemous witch beast clad in flame would be awaiting them. The time they'd spent getting here seemed to be a little quicker compared to last time. Nevertheless, considering that they were going to encounter it, perhaps that place was the witch beast's burrow. He held no fleeting traces of hope that it would have moved from there. If possible, they would have to. Subaru, we've got no choice but to kill it to get past, huh? Ram, I think it'd be productive of us to come up with a plan that can be put into motion with our current fighting strength. Anastasia, we ain't got any fightin' strength even if I use my trump card, and even then, I want to keep that Gruellen thing as a last resort if possible, since I can't undo its effects. Both Anastasia and Ram opposed Subaru's course of action. Though Subaru was annoyed that he'd been denied, even he had no intention of pushing his own opinion on them. In fact, it would be absurd. He hadn't dubbed their group as the non-combatant team for nothing. All the choices which entailed confronting the witch beast would probably end up being reckless. Subaru, on the other hand, there's no way we can go back and take the right path. Ram, after looking at all the different faces you've made up till now, Barusu, I can see that you wouldn't have the guts to go down the right path, isn't that right? Anastasia, but by saying that it means we're cornered. It wouldn't work to do such a laudable thing as to go back to where we started from and wait for the others to come look for us. Right. Ignoring Ram's flippant reply, Anastasia's reply hit the nail on the head. If he still feared the witch beast enough to turn back, then he should have resorted to spinning those words from the beginning and stopping back there. Since he hadn't, his conclusion had left him with just the option of passing by the witch beast. Thus, that didn't mean they couldn't find a way to accomplish that. Subaru, first things first, we need to gather information on our opponent. If everything goes to plan, we have a chance. Subaru spoke out, reaching a conclusion before the other two, who were puzzling over a plan, did. Subaru hardly knew anything about the centaur witchbeast's mode of life. That was due to the fact that he'd come across it for only a few dozen seconds before being burnt alive. All that remained pitifully carved into his soul from that experience was that its grotesque-looking figure made him feel sick to the core, and that it had tremendous firepower. If he briefly thought about it, his manner of death had been such that it felt unavoidable to perceive it as anything other than having been a death in vain. However, it'd be bothersome if he got worked up about it over that. When it came to unexpected deaths, Natsuki Subaru was a veteran. Subaru, first of all, we need to pay attention to the centaur's appearance. Its repulsive appearance was something which you couldn't forget once seen. Though he'd seen it only for a few seconds, its grotesque appearance was seared vividly into his mind. That would give him a helping hand in his reflection. It had a human body on top of a horse body, with its head transformed into a horn. In addition to that, it had a gaping maw across its body. It looked shorty, like something half-assed a child would have made out of clay whilst playing. However, there was something he'd taken notice of when he racked his brain without averting his eyes from his memories. Subaru, it definitely didn't have eyes. In essence, it didn't have a head in the place where you'd usually find one. Thus, he was certain that there hadn't been any organs on that witchbeast's body that provided it with a sense of vision. Or, since there was no light down in the cave systems underneath the sand dunes, without being in possession of a lantern, perhaps the negative effects of moving about down there had caused it to de-evolve. Subaru, something like a mole? It adapted to living underground and lost its eyesight. Or, he wasn't sure whether it had an eyesight to begin with, but at least that witchbeast probably didn't rely on it, and went on about its business without it. Back then, the witchbeast didn't seem to have noticed him due to the lantern light. It had noticed him from the noises and indications he'd let off from his own carelessness. Namely, from either a sense of smell or hearing which the witchbeast would have developed instead of eyes. Subaru, if I'm recalling correctly, I once heard that moles have a good sense of hearing to make up for their rather poor noses. It wasn't something he'd heard from Anastasia earlier, but rather surely some odd knowledge he'd picked up somewhere. However, Subaru's guess ended up far more useful than what he clung to in his groundless thoughts. The centaur's forte was in its sense of hearing. Having come to that conclusion, Subaru sprung into action. Thus, Subaru. Without uttering a single word, Subaru swung his arm up and down as quietly as he could. From the moment he'd stepped onto the sand, he'd taken care so that his footsteps wouldn't make any sound from crunching against the sand. The thing he'd thrown from the extremity of his arm was one of the flasks of water that they'd put in their survival kit. Without any particular aim, the flask flew straight forward to the end of the large cave, drawing the attention of the fiery witch beast in the middle of the cave to where it had landed. Centaur, caw caw. As soon as the flask of water landed on the sand with a quiet clunk, the reaction of the centaur, who heard it, was dramatic. Shaking its blazing mane, the witch beast leapt up with its horse body and galloped forward to the source of the sound. It ferociously rammed its body there with no trace of hesitation. Centaur, caw-caw. Sand billowed up, and flickering sparks flew about around the cave. Thrashing about violently, the centaur skidded around. It gnashed the fangs inside its huge gaping maw together and continued to let out a shrill yowl which sounded like the cries of countless babies crying. It stamped on the flask of water, crushing it flat, and set it aflame over and over again. Once the centaur reduced its original shape to nothing, it let off more flames which were brimming from its mane onto the sand. And when everything other than the parched sand had been burned to a crisp, the witch beast stopped in its tracks with a hint of satisfaction. It did seem to look satisfied. Whilst looking at its handiwork from the corner of his eye, Subaru shook the string he had attached to his waist and motioned them forward. The sound of them carefully stepping on the sand was drowned out by the shrill cries of the witch beast that permeated all across the cave. Taking absolute care with each step, they crept on forward one step at a time. Subaru tugged at his string, indicating a halt to their march, stopping his advancing earth dragon in its tracks. To his surprise, the earth dragon, who shouldn't have been able to understand human speech, had faithfully followed his instructions. It had slowly trodden along the sand with a prudent gait that was not befitting of its large build. Subaru and the others were conducting a march along the precipice of death in the cave that was coated in darkness. Come to think of it, the width of the cave was probably around the size of a school gym, or thereabouts. They were in an area where the charred corpses of the creatures that had been incinerated by the witch beast had fallen just about everywhere. Subaru and the others were trying to move across and get past the witch beast by trying to silence their footsteps and breathing. The area wasn't such that only quietude like that of the grave would descend upon. The centaur's ridiculously large maw was panting wildly over and over again. The sound felt like the awkward sort you'd get from air coming out of a balloon. It wasn't just its appearance, but also its behavior that was repulsive. Nevertheless, he was thankful that it was behaving so plainly right now. Thanks to that, he'd managed to come up with a plan that wouldn't involve fighting. Once again, Subaru took out another flask of water and threw it behind the centaur. The simple-minded witch beast reacted to that sound and once again fiercely assailed the empty flask. Flames and the cries of babies permeated the cave, and the flask of water burst open thanks to the centaur's immense heat. With a parched sound, the flask turned to black charcoal. Regardless of that kerfuffle, Subaru and the others moved forward and managed to shorten their distance to the passageway during that time. This simple diversion was the conclusion Subaru had reached from observing the centaur's mode of life. Having deemed that it didn't have an eyesight, Subaru determined that the centaur relied on its sense of hearing. Leaving Ram and Anastasia behind him, he'd attracted the witch beast's attention by using the same method of throwing stuff. He'd repeated this demonstration a few times until he won over their confidence. The centaur was a witch beast that sought its prey using its sense of hearing. And on top of that, it was a simple-minded creature that could be tricked a bunch of times with the same method. So long as he'd been able to ascertain that, the rest came easy. He'd made Ram gather the items for the diversion as well as made her read where the exit was using the wind, for after they made their escape past the witch beast. After that, he'd scrupulously told Patrash about their covert plan, and the need to keep a strong heart so not to succumb to stress or anxiety, and to just put her game face on. In actuality, Subaru's tactics were working really well to the point that it felt anticlimactic. The distance between the cave and the passageway had already been half cleared, and the time they'd spent stressing wasn't all that much. Since it had no capacity for intuition, the witch beast would probably be clearable by repeating the same thing over and over. Of course, they had dropped the lantern light, and the only thing they could see was the centaur's blazing mane that was crackling in the distance. The lantern light likely wouldn't have affected the sightless witch beast, but still, they'd made the bourgeois decision of narrowing down anything which could trigger its senses as much as they could. Feeling the string being pulled, Subaru's attention, which had wandered off in thought, was brought back to the present. He was holding two strings as he put the diversion into effect. One of them was fastened to Patrash, whilst the other was held by Ram, who was riding on her. The instructions he'd set to Patrash were stop and go. However, its connection between him and Ram hadn't been particularly well stipulated. It was just there to get each other's attention. Even so, their connection using the string that merely conveyed their presence, without being able to look face to face or exchange words, was something that settled Subaru down a rather surprising amount. Having this for now made it so that Subaru wouldn't bear any ill feelings towards Anastasia or Ram. He was in a state of mind where it felt easier for him to not look at someone else's face. On the other hand, it didn't mean that there wasn't any anxiety in his heart, which had grown at ease to such solitude. Subaru had convinced himself that it was partially due to the miasma's influence. However, many parts of the story which Anastasia had told them earlier regarding what miasma is had become cloudy. Would he be cured from its effects when they left this place? In truth, that also felt doubtful now. Supposing he wasn't cured from it, would he end up being unable to get rid of these unpleasant feelings even when he met Emilia and Beatrice? Subaru, The string was suddenly pulled with strength, causing Subaru to unintentionally pitch back. The string that had been pulled was the one that was fastened to Patrash. The Earth Dragon had made a snap decision to stop him by force. And right as he lifted his face up, he immediately saw why. Subaru, ugh. A clump of fire hurled past a step ahead of Subaru. The clump of fire was approximately the same size of a football, but it hurtled past spraying waves of heat to its surroundings. It crashed against a wall of sand a few meters away, letting out a violent booming noise, followed by an explosion. A hot wind gusted out that scorched Subaru's cold body. He barely managed to stop himself from screaming. It would definitely have landed a direct hit if Patrash hadn't stopped him. He didn't know whether it had enough power to kill him, but he was sure that it had enough firepower to injure him. Subaru gritted his teeth, realizing that he'd barely escaped with his life as a shiver ran down his spine. Why had the fireball been thrown at him? Subaru reflexively turned to look behind him. The centaur should have been deceived by his diversion, and should have been messing around with the water flask on the other side of the cave. However, the witch beast now had turned its horned head to where they were, snarling. Just like it knew that Subaru and the others were standing there. Subaru. No way could that be it. Subaru shook his head. Subaru unfastened a water flask from his waist and took hold of it so he could set up the diversion again. The string which connected him with Ram was constantly being tugged, calling him, but he took no note of it. His highest priority now was to lure the witch beast's attention away from them. He swung up the flask of water into an arc and threw it far to the left of the centaur, where it dropped onto the sand. And just as he'd expected, the witch beast's attention turned to that spot and the clumsy beast was attracted to the obvious diversion. Once again, flames gushed out and the lament of crying babies echoed out. And whilst the shrill echo reverberated across the cave, Subaru urged Patrash onwards towards the exit. They just had to keep repeating this predetermined routine over and over again. With just that, they ought to be able to break past, however. Subaru, hook. Once again, the fireball thrown by the centaur hurtled past, next to where Subaru was walking. It had gotten even closer than last time, with the shot being so accurate as to graze his skin. Subaru's breath was instantly taken away from him by the fireball's explosion, and he was buffeted by the wave of heat. Subaru. Bathed in the illumination of the newborn orange light source ahead of him, Subaru locked eyes with the witch beast in the distance. Their eyes didn't actually meet, so saying they locked eyes wasn't quite right. However, the witch beast's attention was clearly focused this way. The witch beast had no way to track them except by sound, so why was it able to find them in the middle of its own cry? Subaru, its own cry. Ram, Barusu, the echo. As the question and answer came together in Subaru's mind, Ram, who was still pulling the string, finally called to him and made a sound. At the moment they both came to the same conclusion, the centaur kicked the sand. Its hooves kicked the surface of the sand, and the witch beast, which was so large they had to look upwards at it, flew lightly through the chilly air. The heat of its blazing mane increased as it moved, and all at once was streaking towards Subaru's group. The human torso attached to the horse's body raised its arms, and pulled away pieces of its own flaming mane. While held in its hands, those pieces changed into balls of fire, and after the blink of an eye, became explosive flaming bullets. Subaru. Run, 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 run. At this point, avoiding a fight with the centaur was no longer possible. Discarding the plan to move with as little noise as possible, Subaru slapped Patrash's haunches, ordering her to run immediately to the corridor. Subaru's group was currently in the exact center of the cave, far from both the corridor they entered from and the one they were moving towards, a position so advantageous for the centaur that it seemed likely this had been the witch beast's plan. Subaru, was it playing about with us? Ram. Subaru's mind froze in amazement, but the witch beast didn't let up. Hurling the fireballs as it created them, the centaur blew clouds of sand into the air around its fleeing targets, as if playing with them. The witch beast had expected that they would run straight for the corridor. Having said that, even if they tried running a zigzag course to confuse it, its hearing captured every sound and wouldn't fall for such a trick. Subaru, whoa. Wah. Grazing their lowered heads, the fireballs were thrown one after another. Out of sight, the witch beast ran circles around them as they fled, not letting up with its explosive barrage, hurling bursts of sand into the air. Subaru, gah. The heat wave of an explosion at his feet lifted Subaru easily into the air and sent him flying. He quickly protected his head with both arms, but the rush of hot air burned the inside of his nose and throat. Breathing was painful, and with the inside of his nose scorched, he temporarily lost his sense of smell. He rolled on the ground from the agony in the center of his face, then raised his teary-eyed face. The mouth in the centaur's torso was open wide, and the toothy maw was emitting an ear-splitting noise, almost looking like it was laughing. No, it was actually laughing. Laughing at the weak human plaything that couldn't even win a battle of wits with a witch beast. Subaru, damn it, arg. Hatred boiled in him, and gave Subaru the strength to stand. Compared to suspicions and mistrust, what a wonderfully healthy feeling it was to hate the vermin that opposed him. As he was swallowed up in a blackness of distilled fury, Subaru snorted at the witch beast that looked so pleased with itself. Acting like it had won was laughable. How could a lowly miasma-hating witch beast think it could ever hope to beat Natsuki Subaru? Subaru. Putting a hand to his waist, he took out his whip. Letting his hand remember the feel of the handle, he lightly flicked the sand with the end of the whip. The centaur immediately stopped its roaring laughter, and intently turned its ears towards the crack of the whip. Most likely, it was the first time it had ever heard that sound. However, that wasn't Subaru's real plan. The whip was nothing more than a diversion. Subaru, invisible providence. In response to the witch beast's violence, a roiling, seething black emotion formed in Subaru's heart. Given direction, it turned into strength to tear the centaur limb from limb. Using it this way made him look like a one-trick pony, but he didn't care. It was a trick that would work on anyone. Subaru. Swinging the whip above his head, he let the witch beast listen to the sound of it splitting the air. Taking care not to alert the centaur, which was paying close attention to the first sound, the invisible magic hand advanced like it was slipping through the darkness, infiltrating the witch beast's shadow, aiming for the horn atop its human torso. Between the human body and the horse body, he couldn't tell which one had vital organs. With its head being a horn, if there was a brain stuffed inside it or not was a mystery. Despite that, there had to be a vital organ of some kind inside. With that decided, he would crush the horn in the palm of his invisible hand. If the loss of the horn happened to make the witch beast obedient, he'd simply have it kill itself. That would be much more pleasant. Subaru. Gu-ak. Ga. With that thought, it happened just as he was about to carry out his plan. Focusing on the centaur, his unseen hand reaching for its head, Subaru's own head was filled with a burst of unimaginable pain. Feeling as though something had stripped away his scalp and was drilling directly into his skull, his eyes rolled back and yellow foam frothed from his lips as he fell to his knees. Subaru, ga. Guh-ak. Bringing both hands to his head as he knelt, he struck himself on the side of the head to try and fight off the pain. Rubbing his head, holding his head, nothing else helped with the pain. To fight the pain, he tried to inflict a sharper, stronger pain. He struck himself again and again, but no matter how hard he hit himself, he couldn't overcome the pain. He rolled on the sand while his head felt like a hell full of thorns piercing his brain, and nearly fainting from pain, he ended up swallowing sand without understanding why. Subaru, it hurts. Ugh. It hurts, it hurts, it hurts. It hurts. He shouted like he was spitting blood. With a mouth full of sand, chewing it with his back teeth, Subaru thrashed on the ground, fighting against the mysterious pain to keep it from blocking his throat. He couldn't fight it, he was losing. Of course, invisible providence had vanished instantly. With that dispersed, he had no way of affecting the centaur. The witch beast, as though disappointed with his lack of resistance, prepared to turn him into a smoking corpse. A huge ball of flame drove away the chill in the air, as the explosive heat warmed the world around them. Just like that, Natsuki Subaru would be changed into charcoal. Patrash, Ka. At the last moment, the jet-black earth dragon charged in fiercely, tearing away the witch beast's arm. Patrash. With a body color that blended into the darkness, the earth dragon had soundlessly approached the witch beast, and landed a biting attack. Losing its balance along with its arm, the witch beast dropped the fireball it had raised above its own head. In other words, the heat of the fireball the witch beast had created exploded at its own feet, and the point-blank blast wave blew it into the air. As it was thrown away by the explosion, blood dripped from the centaur's wounded arm, and it fell over on its back. Without sparing it a glance, Patrash sprinted over the sand, and holding Subaru's clothing with her teeth as he thrashed in pain, she immediately began a sprinting retreat. Held by Patrash's teeth near his waist, swinging left and right as he dangled, tormented by poor circulation and the continuing headache, Subaru looked behind him. Behind Patrash, the centaur unsteadily rose to its feet. The wound on its human torso foamed, and the left arm, that had been bitten off, grew back in an instant. Its monstrous regeneration ability was at work on its other injuries as well. The wounds all over its body, inflicted by the explosion moments ago, closed one after another. The centaur returned to full health in a matter of seconds. With that done, there was nothing left to slow it down. Screaming viciously at Patrash, who had struck it by surprise, the centaur sped up to pursue the madly fleeing earth dragon, and its mane blazed brighter as it leapt. Patrash's running ability was impressive in even the worst terrain, but the centaur's was in its own habitat, and its acceleration was a step ahead. Along with their difference in size, Patrash was weighed down by Subaru, and the witch beast was soon running side by side with her. A burning fireball appeared in the witch beast's hand, but this one was stretched tall. Looking closer, the fireball changed in the witch beast's hand to a long-handled weapon, and in the blink of an eye, it had become a spear, covered from end to end in flame. Centaur, caw-caw. Raising the flaming spear, the centaur drove the tip towards Patrash. The black earth dragon ducked as the spear approached, almost diving into the sand to avoid the attack, and using that as an opening to speed up further. However, just when it looked like they could get away, the witch beast's hoof drove straight into the earth dragon's torso from the side. The force of the attack passed through her hard skin, and she cried out as the impact smashed into her guts. Even then, she refused to drop Subaru, still dangling from her teeth. The heat he could feel near his waist was from the blood Patrash was coughing up from her internal injuries. That was the only sign she was badly injured. However, she still wouldn't let Subaru go, and Subaru had no way to care for his loyal dragon's wounds. All he had was the seemingly eternal torture of the unending pain in his head. Ram, El Fula. Anastasia, Jewald. A second strike from the flaming spear was aimed at Patrash, who was clearly slowing down. However, before it reached the earth dragon's body, it was interrupted from two different directions. From one side came an invisible blade of wind, from the other was a convergence of white-hot rays of heat. Both of the incantations came from familiar voices, but that was all Subaru could say for sure. Both spells landed direct hits on the witch beast, blowing holes through its body and cutting through the human torso at an angle. Those wounds, too, closed instantly. Ram, Barusu. Oh fine, if you're dead, you should say so. Anastasia, that's a nasty one, that witch beast. I won't be able to do much to that thing. Even though it sounded normal, one of the girl's voices carried a trace of desperation. On the other hand, despite being in a desperate situation, one of the girl's voices lacked any sense of stress. Feeling his loyal dragon's breath and blood on his skin, Subaru was on the verge of falling unconscious. If he was going to go through this much pain and torment, maybe dying wasn't so. Ram, don't you dare die, Barusu. Rem would cry. Subaru, wo? That voice, shouted right in his ear, cut through the pain and reached his brain. What the voice awakened was a hatred no less than the one he held for the witch beast. They had forgotten. Not a single one of them remembered that girl. Don't talk about Rem, and I like you know anything about it. Subaru, invisible Providence E. Releasing his feelings of anger towards the witch beast passing through the edge of his tear-stained vision, Subaru struck at it with a pitch-black magical hand in an outburst of rage. Partway there, another raging pain tore at his skull before he was swallowed by it and lost consciousness. Subaru's unseen hand hit the witch beast's spear head-on, breaking it as a token act of defiance. That was all the resistance he could muster. Centaur, caw-caw. The reward for his angry counterattack was another burst of furious pain. The centaur planted its front legs in the sandy ground and pivoted on them, turning itself around forcefully, and then its rear legs lashed out like a catapult. Its solid rock-like hooves kicked sand into the air as they sped towards Subaru's group himself, Patrash, and Ram and Anastasia, who were likely nearby as well, intending to tear through them all at once. In an explosion of leg strength sufficient to bring down part of the cave, everyone was sent flying different directions by the wave of sand. Subaru was even torn away from Patrash's jaw, rolling helplessly on top of the sand, and thrown by the aftermath of the impact against a destroyed, burned body. Subaru, A headache that couldn't be described, and a body trampled by the centaur's kick. Assaulted by continuous pain from the inside and out, Subaru could no longer hold on to his consciousness. Somehow, as he rolled loosely on the sand, he could feel the approaching darkness of death. Destruction, annihilation, futile death, death in battle. Heartless words like that roamed the back of his mind, but Subaru. In a situation where his lungs had forgotten to even breathe, Subaru saw someone standing in front of him. It was a small, delicate shadow. In a world with too little light, he couldn't see it clearly. Even then, it was a familiar shape that he knew immediately. It was Ram. She was wobbling as she stood. She had both arms outstretched to protect Subaru. Stop it. It's stupid, impossible, useless. He tried to say it, but his throat would no longer listen to him, as though it was filled with sand. No, it actually was filled with sand. Because of the sand he'd stupidly swallowed trying to fight the pain in his head, Subaru could no longer even speak clearly. Subaru, why? With all his strength, Subaru managed a weak cry. Despite all the pent-up dissatisfaction and anger he had felt towards Ram and his other friends, that surely they must have known about. Ram would cry. Ram made only that quiet response to Subaru's words. For the little sister she couldn't remember, for the person most dear to that unremembered sister, Ram stood. What pushed her to go that far, Subaru couldn't understand. He couldn't understand that, but there was one thing he did understand. At this rate, Ram was going to die. Subaru would die too. There was no way to avoid it. Subaru. The centaur bellowed, swinging both its arms and creating a blazing sword in each of them. They didn't really look like swords though, so perhaps it had meant to make hammers or axes. Regardless, they were both weapons wrapped in flame. It stood on the verge of using them to cut Ram's much smaller frame into pieces, and roast Subaru as well. Subaru, come on. There's gotta be something. Staring death in the face, Subaru reached down through the depths of his pain. Fighting against the relentless pain was like diving deep into himself. Looking outside himself, to Ram, Patrash, or Anastasia was unrealistic. Even if it would be derided as a dream or delusion, Subaru looked inside himself for something, anything. This unrealistic approach was the most realistic hope he had left. Diving inside, reaching into the murky depths of his body, pulling aside the writhing black thoughts, Subaru looked inside himself for anything that could help. Not the unseen hand he had overused. Something different, something new, some way to pull through this mess. His last-ditch search yielded. Subaru, Nothing, and Subaru watched as the witch beast in front of him raised its swords. The flames crossed above the witch beast's head, and after a moment's pause, descended towards Ram. Burning the very air, the oncoming slashes would heartlessly cut a burning path through the girl's slender body, burn her away, leave nothing of the path she had walked, the memories she had held, or anything at all except black charcoal. At that scene, Subaru cried out against his own powerlessness. The next moment, white light unleashed with tremendous speed blew away the witch beast's upper body. The body of the witch beast which had wielded those swords of flame vanished from the world thanks to that tremendous light. The light didn't bring forth such simplicities like crushing or severing its body, but rather it was the literal meaning of annihilation. The centaur was a monster that had a human body on the head part of a horse's body. And the light had blown away the part which was construed as its human body from chest up. Of course, that included the arms on its shoulders, the horn which was in place of a human head, and the fang maw that gaped across its chest. Blood soundlessly gushed out from the witch beast's wounds from the impact, and immediately after, its wounds started to foam, readying itself to use the same hyper-recovery technique it had used thus far. Its squirming flesh swelled up, and its obliterated human body reformed anew. The human body regenerated right away, and explosive balls of fire quickly surged into life on both of its arms. Centaur, caw-caw. The centaur roared, and the alluring voice of countless babies filled the chilly air. Turning its body around, the witch beast paid no heed to Ram or Subaru, and instead leapt straight up towards the dangerous enemy that had blown away its upper body. The witch beast summoned a heap-load of fireballs on its arms and cast them one after the other as it rushed forward. Consumed by its heated frenzy, the witch beast prepared to unleash its own battle cry. However, Centaur, caw-caw. The fireballs brought into existence by the witch beast were all intercepted from in front of it one by one. The things responsible for that were the flashes of white light that pierced the fireball's head on with tremendous accuracy. The speed of the flashes of light were out of the ordinary, and its strength was clearly superior to that of the fireballs. The lumps of flame were struck by the light dead on, pulled in by the power of it, and clashed against the body of the witch beast itself. Immediately after Subaru had thought the centaur had ended up like a hedgehog with quills of white light, the flames exploded all around the witch beast's body. The centaur's arms were obliterated to nothing, its maw was torn to shreds, its horse body was burnt, and finally it had collapsed. It thrashed about on top of the sand, letting off a shrill cry in sheer anger. However, the witch beast's wounds squirmed over, and it refused to die. It was as if it was telling them to grow stronger, to change their approach, and that they should evolve their manner of bestowing death, since they couldn't achieve it by blowing away parts of it into nothing. The witch beast's appearance transformed as it regenerated its lost parts. The human part of its body changed, now its arms had increased from 2 to 4, and sharp, long fangs jutted out from its maw. Its lower horse half also had more legs, numbering 8 in total. Doing a simple calculation, they had doubled in quantity. As well as that, its charred skin had hardened, now shining with a black luster to it. At a glimpse, it maybe looked like a being that was clad in armor. And it held an axe, a hammer, a spear, and a sword of flame in each of its newly added arms. The witch beast had managed to evolve itself in an unbelievably short period of time, all to alter itself, so it could face the being casting the white rays of light. Raising its 4 forelegs, the centaur thunderously let out a roar. It clacked its raised hooves together with a piercing clang and began to spur forwards. Its huge figure was similar to that of an armored train decked in steel. Its weight and acceleration would easily turn any opponent to mincemeat, causing them to meet a vicious end. The being that had put the witch beast to shame would end up being completely annihilated if it was treated to a fiery finishing blow. Centaur, caw caw. Kicking sand up into the air, a white light pierced it, and trailing up a white light pierced it, a plume of fiery heat. The witch beast fiercely, a white light pierced it, broke through. A white light pierced it, the heat of its flames, a white light pierced it, had flared up, a white light pierced it hotter than ever before. It was like a white light pierced it, the hellfire, a white light pierced it of the abyss. Its grotesque and atypical figure, a white light pierced it, made it so that you couldn't avoid. A white light pierced it, breaking into shudders. When a white light pierced it, you caught a mere glimpse of it. A white light pierced it regardless who you were. A white light pierced it, that was what the king of the sand sea was. A white light pierced it, 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 a white light pierced I, a white light pierced I, a white light pierced I, a white light pierced, 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 a white light pie, a white light pie, a white light pie, a white light, a white light, a white light. Subaru. There was nothing left behind anymore right after the crazy amount of light had streamed out. The witch beast, which had wielded such menace, had been completely obliterated by the light all the way up to the smithereens of its flesh. The witch beast had completely been blown away somewhere far out of this world. The only thing that was left on the sand was the countless number of light rays which had been fired at the witch beast to erase its existence. The source of that came just from those white, elongated stingers. Those two instantly turned to powder as if they'd effloresced away. Subaru. Subaru had even forgotten his headache as he gazed aghast at the spectacle with his own eyes. He realized that a feverish, slender body had happened to leap in between his arms. It was Ram. He didn't remember what had happened, but it seemed like he'd been embracing her body in their final moments. Though it should have been a meaningless gesture, it looked like Ram wasn't conscious. Subaru. Subaru could hear the sound of someone stepping on the sand. That someone was ever so slowly approaching Subaru and the others. They were definitely approaching them. The inside of the cave was still enveloped in darkness along with a frigid silence. The only source of light came from the scattered fiery scraps that had been spewed out by the witch beast earlier. There was one such fiery scrap right next to Subaru that allowed him to look around a few meters. Someone's foot entered the very edge of his field of vision. Subaru. Lifting his face up, Subaru looked up to where the owner of those feet, and perhaps the one behind that light, was. Gradually lifting up his field of vision, what he saw reflected in his bleary eyes was a human being. Subaru. It was a woman. A woman with a rather queer air to her. Her legs were audaciously bare all the way up to her thighs, and the only thing that covered her crotch was the hem of her shorts that were just barely cut down for that task. Above that, her waist and belly button were exposed. A piece of cloth was wound above her slender waist like a muniate to keep her breasts concealed. However, she wore something akin to a cloak from her shoulders, which barely protected the greater part of her body, exposed from her pale shoulders, from the wind. Her hair was a brown that was closer to black to the point that it seemed to blend in with the darkness around them. Her long hair was tied into a ponytail that collected all of it together. She gazed at Subaru and the others with moist eyes which were chock full of thick emotion. Her thin lips curved up, breaking into a rather bestial smile. I found you. At least I can understand what she's saying, Subaru thought to himself. And just as he thought that, his consciousness reached its limit. Tasting the feeling of sand, Subaru let go of his consciousness still without uttering a single word. At least, it didn't seem like he'd have to let go of the girl wrapped inside his arms. He held her tight. He only had enough willpower left to persevere to that point. End of chapters 16 through 17, Chewed Remains.